Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. It's Dhaiphong here with another stream. As you can see, I'm joined by Ben Norton of Geopolitical Economy Report. Be sure to follow all of his work in the website link in the video description. How are you doing today, Ben?
I'm great, Danny. Thanks for having me. But I'm always a
Yeah.
big fan of your show, so it's great to connect.
Yes, it'll be a fun one today because there's a lot of stuff happening. Before we begin, though, everyone, make sure you're hitting that like button to ensure more people know about this stream, to boost the algorithm. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you are new. Hit that notifications bell so maybe you'll find out about this stream. And of course, support the work in all the ways possible in the links in the description, Patreon, Substack, and many more. But okay, Ben, let's get started. First, you've been doing some good coverage on the situation in Niger. And July 26th, as my viewers may know, there was a coup that deposed the Western-backed head of state, Mohamed Bazoum. And there have been a lot of threats of war coming from France, the U.S. side. There's maybe a bit of more tepid approach, but we just had a visit, actually, from Victoria Nuland, the Deputy Secretary of State. You've done a lot of good coverage on Nuland and her role in Ukraine, as well as her infamous neocon husband, Robert Kagan, I should say, and her role in the Maidan Revolution, etc. But she wasn't even allowed to speak to the I think his name is Mr. Chiani, the general who was claimed head of state. I think they appointed a prime minister today, but she wasn't able to speak to anyone on any side. The arrested Bazoum, Chiani, she only was able to speak to the defense chief. And so it wasn't a warm welcome. And I'm wondering about your reaction to this. There was warnings about Wagner, PMC, Russia's paramilitary group, private contractor, warnings against doing that. The U.S. has cut off aid. There's so many pieces to this story. Where would you like to begin, Ben?
Well, we should begin with why there's so much Western interest in Niger. This is one of the poorest countries on earth. As of a report from 2013 by Oxfam, they reported that 90% of people in Niger did not have electricity. That figure has slightly decreased since then, but still, we're talking about a country where, according to World Bank data, nearly half the population lives in extreme poverty, not just poverty, extreme poverty, over 40%. So why is the US and France so interested? Well, of course, Niger was a French colony, along with most of West Africa. And what's not very well known is that France still maintains economic control over these countries through the use of the CFA franc, which the name CFA franc, which was created in the 1940s, that had the word colonial in it. They renamed it using the same acronym, but it's still the same acronym. And the C was colonial, the colonial franc in Africa. And what that also states is that not only is that pegged to the euro, but it also, which means that these countries have no monetary sovereignty. It means that their monetary policy is dictated by the European Central Bank. But furthermore, the CFA franc system, there are two different economic systems in West Africa in which the franc is imposed. And it says that half of the foreign exchange reserves of central banks in West Africa, in countries like Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso, they have to hold half of their reserves in the French treasury in Paris. So, I mean, this is economic neocolonialism. These countries don't have control over their economic policies. And furthermore, we haven't even talked about their natural resources. This is a very rich region of the world when it comes to natural resources. You know, as Michael Prenti often said, it's not that these countries are poor. Their people have been made poor, but they're actually very wealthy countries. They have very plentiful natural resources. And all across West Africa, I mean, many of these countries are major gold producers, including Niger and Mali. In the case of Mali being, one of its top exports is gold, and yet the majority of people live in poverty. In Niger, it's not only gold, but also uranium, the radioactive metal that is needed for nuclear energy. And France relied on roughly 1/5 of its uranium imports coming from Niger. The European Union also relied on roughly 1/5 of its uranium imports coming from Niger. And in the case of France, nuclear energy is not an insignificant factor, right? I mean, 1/3 of France's electricity comes from nuclear power, much more than in many other countries like the United States, for instance. In fact, in recent years, France has used more nuclear energy than electricity coming from oil. So that is to say that, think about how important oil is for a modern economy, at least for energy. In the case of France, it really needs uranium. You know who the other major producers of uranium are in the world? Kazakhstan and Russia. So while the European Union is trying to break its energy partnership with Russia, boycotting Russian oil and putting the $60 price cap, they're trying also $50 price cap on Russian oil. And also, of course, there are many countries trying to reduce their imports of Russian gas, although that's actually much slower than the decrease in imports of Russian oil. So we see an attempt to cut off their energy partnership with Russia, but now they're losing another major provider of uranium. So, I mean, then there's also the geostrategic element in terms of military force. And this is another key element of neocolonialism. Not only France, but the United States has a massive military footprint all across West Africa and all across the African continent. I mean, AFRICOM, U.S. African Command, has U.S. Special Operations Forces and other forces, more conventional forces, in more than half of the countries in the African continent. And in the case of Niger, the U.S., at least recent reports showed the U.S. had 1,000 troops and France has 1,500 troops. Now, the new nationalist government in Niger has said that they've broken their military ties with France, torn up their military agreements with France, and told the French troops to leave. And what was Paris's response? No, we're not going to leave because we don't recognize you as a legitimate government. So the U.S. and France have very strategic bases in Niger. In the case of the United States, it spent $110 million building a massive drone base. It was the largest base ever built by the U.S. Air Force. And the U.S. spends $20 to $30 million a year just maintaining that drone base. And it uses that base in Niger in the center of the Sahel region to exercise military control over the Sahel in countries like Mali, where there was a French military intervention in 2013 and 2014. So, I mean, these are all the details that we need to have in mind when we're talking about what's going on in Niger, not this infantile discussion of democracy, as if Victoria Nuland, one of the main architects of the coup in Ukraine in 2014, that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, who is geopolitically neutral, and installed an undemocratic pro-Western regime. Now she is lecturing countries about democracy. I mean, it's absolutely beyond satire. I mean, this reality is more satirical than satire.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this is you have Victoria Nuland, who is literally the architect or an agent, a direct agent of the coup in Ukraine, which, of course, has been erased from historical record. And the neocons, the foreign policy establishment, does everything it can to do that from the U.S. and Western side. But at the same time, you've had in this case with Niger and similarly with Burkina Faso that you've also written about, and Mali, these countries, Guinea, all of these countries have had coups, and now these coups are being railed against, despite the fact that not only is Nuland one of the foremost players in the Ukraine coup, but this is U.S. foreign policy we're talking about, and even just the entire so-called collective West, the West. Coups are pretty instrumental in the entire foreign policy of the West. So why is it that these coups are so problematic, Ben? Because I've heard some cynicism coming out of social media circles, and there's always the left position of, well, coups are always bad, and don't replace, it's not good to just replace Western imperialism with Russia or with, maybe imperialism with a black face. What do you have to say to all of these arguments? And why is it then that the West is so bent out of shape about these coups?
Well, the obvious answer is because these countries in West Africa, not only Niger, also Burkina Faso, Mali, potentially Guinea, which is kind of playing both sides. Even Chad is not really on board with the West right now. This is a region of the world where there are nationalist governments that are exercising political control, sovereignty, and also specifically economic control over their natural resources. I've been reading a lot of the financial press's response because I think it's often you learn much more from the financial press than you learn from the political press, because the political press is pure ideology. It's all about ideological management, manufacturing consent. The financial press is written for investors, for capitalists who are trying to make money in all of this. They don't care about all of the propaganda and all of that. They just want to know whether or not they should withdraw their capital or invest, right? And if you read the financial press, they're much more pragmatic, and they're like, yeah, there's a possibility these governments could nationalize their resources, and that's why we're so angry. S&P Global, which runs a market intelligence firm, linked to the S&P 500, right? The market index. The S&P Global Commodities Insight, which is this market intelligence firm, published a report in which they quoted a former State Department official who's now, working in commodities markets. And he said, our biggest concern is that in Mali and in Burkina Faso, the nationalist governments have nationalized the gold mining. He just said it clearly, like, we're really concerned about this. Previously, there were a lot of foreign companies, Western companies, involved in mining the gold in these countries, and they were kicked out. Now the mining is being run, with state direction, with some help probably from other countries as well. But the point is that they just get straight to the point. And in the case of Niger, we've seen reports. It's hard to confirm whether or not it's really true. I've tried to investigate, but it's really hard to find a lot of the video footage because a lot of this is really only on TV in Niger. They don't really have a lot of live streaming on the internet. Again, this is one of the poorest countries in the world. But there have been reports that Niger has blocked exports of uranium and gold to the West. And that would make sense because it would be in the same pattern as what happened in Mali and Burkina Faso. So this is completely anathema to Western foreign policy, which is always about making these extremely favorable, unequal agreements. Going back to the unequal treaties imposed on China. These are these unequal agreements that these countries with plentiful natural resources are forced to sign with multinational corporations like French mining companies, French energy companies, and US companies to mine a lot of these minerals. And the country ends up getting a little tiny percentage of the profits. And with a lot of these neoliberal governments, that money just ends up going to the pockets of the elites, right? So the working class people of Niger who live in poverty don't see the benefits of gold mining. I mean, it's just, again, I just want to stress that point. These are countries that are exporting gold, a symbol of wealth, and yet the majority of their people live in poverty because of these unequal agreements where the governments don't actually get the proceeds, the revenues from this natural resource extraction. And again, those who do, it just ends up in the pockets of a few rich elites. So also, of course, these governments are popular. In fact, The Economist, the voice of the Western bourgeoisie, Lenin famously called The Economist the journal that speaks for the British millionaires. And I, would update it 100 years later. It's the corporate media outlet that speaks on behalf of transatlantic billionaire oligarch capitalists, right? That's The Economist. I mean, they are the embodiment of neoliberalism. And they just published an article that showed that 78% of people in Niger support the nationalist policies of the military government. 73% of Nigerians, not Nigerians, Nigerians, the people in Niger, 73% want the military government to stay in power. Nearly 3/4, only 1/4, just over 1/4, 27% want to put back in power the Western puppet, Mohamed Bazoum. And I've been reading a lot of these articles. The Financial Times in May did an interview with Bazoum, and he was just, in the entire interview, he was defending France. And he was criticizing what he called populists in Niger who said that France is still a colonial power. And he said, that's ridiculous. France is our partner. This is the president who was overthrown. I mean, a complete Western puppet. And even according to The Economist magazine, the voice of neoliberalism and imperialism, even they acknowledge that just around 1/4 of people in Niger want him back in power, whereas 3/4 support the military government. And another very interesting part of this poll, they asked people in Niger what country they see as their most important ally. So it was a superlative, right? You only can say one country. Over 60% said Russia. Nearly 2/3, the majority of people said Russia is their most important ally. Now, the US and France were very low. China was very low, but as I've been pointing out, that doesn't mean that they're against China, because obviously China and Russia are very close allies. They have a very similar foreign policy in Africa. The way the question was framed is you can only pick one country who's the most important ally. So just because they said Russia doesn't mean they're anti-China. There's actually probably a lot of them who probably do support China. But the point is that, I mean, we're seeing a massive shift politically in the region. There's a lot of opposition to French neocolonialism and US imperialism. And there's a lot of support for Russia and also China. And obviously this explains why the West is so angry and is trying to reimpose this guy, Mohamed Bazoum, because he's such an obedient Western ally, despite the fact that the majority of Nigerians don't want him.
Yeah, and I know you've seen the videos, pictures circulating all over the internet, massive protests, massive rallies in support of the government, and there's been more than a few Russian flags popping up. And actually, a Patreon supporter had a question that really does flow into this point here, because Raul asked, how do you respond to people? Because one of the reasons why Nuland went to Niger was because of reports saying that the new government was reaching out to Wagner PMC, for perhaps help in what could be a war, an intervention, a foreign intervention, likely led by France and ECOWAS. And so Raul wanted to ask, how do you respond to people who say that Wagner's interventions in Africa, because Wagner is in Mali, Wagner is in a few countries in North Africa, West Africa. What do you have to say to those folks who say that it's the same as Western imperialism, that, it's similar, and if it's not the West, then it's going to be them? It's almost like this Cold War mentality, and you see it all across the Western media. And of course, Victoria Nuland went running to Niger to warn that this new government about that. What do you have to say to this?
It's completely ridiculous. I mean, just look at the actual, not only the historical atrocities committed by French colonialism, but the continued policies of French neocolonialism. I mean, I talked about this early at the beginning because it's almost never mentioned, even by a lot of people like who I absolutely 100% respect and are friends and comrades and everything. They often forget when we're talking about Niger. This is a country whose currency is controlled by France. I mean, that is the epitome of neocolonialism. What is the currency of Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso? It's the CFA franc, which is controlled by France. These countries don't have monetary sovereignty. And if you don't have monetary sovereignty, how can you have economic sovereignty, yet alone political sovereignty, right? I mean, so this is actual neocolonialism. But furthermore, I mean, and again, not to mention the genocide committed by French and also Belgian colonialism in this region, the millions of people who lost their lives, whether it's the Belgian control of the Congo and the genocide killing half of the Congolese population, and then later killing the first ever democratically elected prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, with an operation backed by the CIA, or Algeria, where France committed genocide. Not that well remembered, France had concentration camps for Algerians after World War II, after the Nazi concentration camps. France made concentration camps for Algerians to try to maintain control over Algeria. And of course, the Algerian people overthrew French colonialism in a popular revolution that happened over years but ended in 1962. So, I mean, the point is that this brutal colonial history, comparing that to Russia potentially giving some support to these countries, is laughable. It shows how superficial the analysis of imperialism is by many of these people who claim to be anti-imperialists. if you're actually an anti-imperialist, you need to actually understand how imperialism operates. And furthermore, let's not exaggerate Russia's influence. There's no evidence whatsoever that Russia had a hand in the coup in Niger, or that Wagner is even on the ground. In fact, if you read Russian media, which, Russian state media, which obviously is not biased against Russia, even they have been saying that, yeah, like Russian influence is overstated here. So RT published an interesting article by this guy, Andrei Maslov, who previously he was the director of Gazprom in Nigeria, which is the Russian state-owned gas giant. So he's clearly linked to the Russian government, and he's an Africa expert. And in this article, he said that, look, and in fact, if you look at Russia diplomatically, formally diplomatically, Russia actually condemned the coup. That doesn't mean that Russia doesn't favorably see the new government. And I think it's very fair to conclude that they obviously are happy about what's happening, but that doesn't mean that they're behind it. At the United Nations Security Council, there was a consensus to condemn the coup. And that's because Russia, and also China, but more Russia, has a consistent position condemning coups anywhere. I mean, because obviously they don't want to support coups. China actually, I think, has had the best position. They just haven't commented on it. They don't intervene, and they don't comment on other people's what's happening in other countries in their internal affairs. And furthermore, he pointed out in this article that, there's all this talk about Wagner. Well, clearly the Russian government and Wagner are not really on the same page. And, there's been these comments, about how, Wagner has been trying to take credit and praising the coup and all this stuff. But there's a long history of Wagner exaggerating its influence. And just because they say stuff on social media, now, ironically, what this actually does is it actually helps Russia, because Western powers are trying to portray every single anti-colonial movement in the world as being led by Putin puppets, right? And what that actually does is help further solidify Russia's reputation in the global South, which is very positive. And, I know Latin America very well. I've never been to Africa. I would never claim to be an Africa expert. But from the polls we've seen, in many parts of Africa, Russia is very popular because of the history of the Soviet Union supporting anti-colonial struggles. And in Latin America, which I do know very well, Russia is very popular, especially among the left, especially among anti-imperialists, because of that history of the Soviet Union. And because today, despite the fact that Russia has a capitalist government, it has maintained a foreign policy that is non-interventionist. They don't intervene in the affairs of Latin American and African nations. And obviously, they're going to be supportive of a country that it's opposing Western neocolonialism. So ironically, by exaggerating Russia's influence, this is only further solidifying Russia's reputation as an ally of anti-colonial movements. So I'm sure, the Russian government is happy with this, because, there's no evidence whatsoever linking them to the coup, and also in Mali and Burkina Faso. But by the Ukrainian government's trying to blame Russia, and that actually, ironically, just helps solidify its reputation.
And it is laughable in a lot of ways, because even Yevgeny Prigozhin, during Nuland's visit, went to the media and said, we're so proud of Wagner and what they're doing, because we have Nuland running to Niger begging us not to help. It's obvious that we're a pretty effective force. And that poll you were speaking of earlier too, it makes me think about, Burkina Faso, I think in the last 24 hours had a horrific terrorist attack. I think killed 20 people. And these attacks, especially since the destruction of Libya, have been so widespread all across the Sahel. And Wagner has played. It's not a huge presence. It's about, I think, a couple thousand spread across various countries, but they do frontline help. And it's not just Russians who are participating in this. Wagner has many different nationalities who actually participate. It's a military contractor. So they have Africans, they have people from, Europe, Eastern Europe, and, it is, but the fact that it is coming from Russia, that direct aid, it's not a surprise that people would appreciate that, because this issue alone, it has been a huge talking point, a huge political issue, and of course an economic issue, because if you're already languishing in poverty, what does it mean to have a completely unstable political situation and perhaps life or death, every single day, just trying to go about your day? It's life or death, because you never know. that's how often and frequent this happens. You never know when there's going to be an attack. And so I'm not surprised about that. And China has a completely non-interference in policy where they don't send the People's Liberation Army to help fight terrorism there. They're more about the UN and going through that mechanism. So I'm not surprised by the poll numbers, but I just think it's interesting that the more that the US and the West raise this alarmism across the political spectrum about Wagner, the more it highlights the role of Wagner and possibly actually strengthens this matters. I think people all across the world, especially on the African continent, look at this kind of coverage and they say, well, perhaps Russia is doing something right here.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about this is often just really informed by my experience in Latin America, which, again, I would never claim to be an Africa expert, I've never been, but I think there are a lot of similarities in many global South, developing countries, formerly colonized countries. And something that I've noticed in my time in Latin America is that a lot of states are actually very weak. And in the global North, in imperialist countries, there's often this very anarchist influence in a lot of left-wing movements because the state is seen as the enemy, because the state is controlled by billionaire capitalist oligarchs and acts on behalf of the interests of big corporations against the interests of working people. So they assume that every state around the world is like that. And they assume also that every state around the world is this hyper-militarized, violent, repressive apparatus like in the US, where, police every year kill over 1,000 people. But the reality is that in a lot of global South countries, especially very poor ones, the state is very weak. And in fact, in relation to international capital, the state is much weaker. I mean, as an example, in many global South countries that, like in Central America, which I know very well, the GDP of the entire country, all of the goods and services produced in the economy, is smaller than the revenue of big, massive multinational corporations. So if you're in a country like Niger and your GDP, your entire economy is smaller than the revenue of big multinational mining corporations, think about what that means in terms of the government's power, in terms of its relationship to capital. I mean, these are very weak states. And furthermore, think about their military capabilities, considering how few resources they have. It also, by the way, explains why there frequently are coups in these countries, and some of them, although the majority are not, but there are some progressive coups led by leftist anti-colonial military leaders. And, in the case of Egypt, you had Nasser. In Libya, you had Gaddafi. In Burkina Faso, you had Thomas Sankara, who led a progressive military coup. And it's because in many of these countries, one of the only strong institutions is the military. So many other state institutions are completely weak. So the reality is that a lot of these people, they're not looking to abolish the state like these anarchists. In fact, it's the opposite. They have too weak of a state. They want a stronger state. And because the military is so weak, it can't actually maintain security. And you have the rise of these fascist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which also have very questionable links to Western intelligence agencies, right? I mean, in Syria, in Libya, the US, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, they were supporting these so-called moderate rebels, and they were flooding these countries with weapons. And when those weapons go to Libya, they don't stay in Libya, especially after NATO destroyed the Libyan state in this 2011 war, and they killed Gaddafi. And then Hillary Clinton went on TV and said, we saw he died. All of those weapons went into neighboring countries like Niger, like Mali, like Burkina Faso. So you have a weak state, a weak military, a massive influx of weapons from the West to these extremist Salafi jihadist militias, which have a history of being linked to Western intelligence agencies and being supported by Western intelligence agencies when it's in their political interest. I mean, it is no surprise why many of these governments are looking for new potential allies to help them fight against these insurgencies, because clearly, over many years of US and French support, they have not succeeded in defeating Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and ISIS affiliates. So, I mean, you also have to ask, is it in the political interest of the US and France to actually defeat these Salafi jihadist groups, or to just maintain the insurgency at a low manageable level, not end it, but maintain it at a simmer. So when something like this happens, you allow them to attack the government, right? I'm not saying that like they don't even need to support these groups, but now they're going to be like, okay, we will allow these groups to attack the military government, which is exactly what's happening right now. There have been reports that ISIS and Al-Qaeda have been attacking Wagner units in Mali and also attacking forces on the Mali-Niger border. So again, does France actually want these groups to be defeated permanently, or does it want them to be maintained in a low simmer, which allows France to have an excuse to maintain its military occupation of these countries? And obviously the same is for the US as well.
Yeah, I mean, those are all really good points, and these are points that are not so much discussed right now. That context of even just this last 12 plus years. I mean, the US's entire military relationship to the entire continent is based on this threat of Salafi jihadists and what they've done, and that threat was directly created by them. And what's so interesting now is that these countries like Niger, they look at Wagner and they say, wow, we see what you did in Syria. Can you help us do that here? It is this seemingly slow rolling, but it's speeding up, this decline, no matter how much the US and its Western partners need this military presence as basically the entire justification for its Africa policy. It is dwindling in legitimacy, and these coups from Niger, Burkina Faso earlier, all of them are pointing to, I think, a growing rejection of this. And so,
Danny,
yeah,
I'm sorry to cut you off. I thought of something when you were speaking there.
Sure.
Just an analogy, very briefly. When I was in college, I went to at a lecture. It was an interesting lecture by a cancer researcher who was talking about the fight against cancer. And I remember being struck by something he said. This was someone at a very prestigious university. I don't remember where. Maybe it was Cleveland Clinic or something. And I remember he said that a lot of people assume that we want to end cancer. We want to, cure cancer. But actually, we don't want to cure cancer overnight. If we had the possibility, we wouldn't want to do that, because the entire industry, all of our research, all of this is about cancer prevention and treatment. And if we just cure it overnight, then obviously, what are we going to do? The entire industry basically collapses. And this is someone who obviously was very close to, a corporate interest, not just speaking on behalf of research, right? A lot of research is corporate funded and all this. But the point is, anyway, that he was saying that we want to find ways to treat cancer and minimize cancer's death rate. But we don't, if we had a magic wand to end cancer overnight, we wouldn't want to. And I think if Western militaries probably see Al-Qaeda and ISIS the exact same way. If they had a magic wand and could get rid of Boko Haram tomorrow, they probably wouldn't want to do that, because then they could no longer have the rationale of maintaining a constant military presence with thousands of troops and drone bases operating in countries like Niger and Mali.
Yes, and this is all they have. This is all that, I mean, we see Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, all these countries are increasingly rejecting France's neocolonialism, and that has a huge economic basis to it. But the US's economic role on the continent is very, very small, very, very, very small. And so without a military presence, without this expanding base structure, Africa Command, partnerships, so-called partnerships in Africa, drone bases, counter terrorism, special operations, all of that. Without all of that, the U.S. basically has very little to do in Africa. But maybe we can get to Brics now, because we've been speaking about Africa for a while, and I know I have you for a good amount of time, but I feel like Brics is a huge topic given the summit coming up, August 22nd to 24th. And so, Russia Briefing, which is part of this, I want to just pull up this article that I found in the past week. So Russia Briefing, which is part of Is this coming up good? What is this? All right, let me just, okay, so here it is. So, Russia Briefing is part of the Dazan Shearer and Associates, originally founded in Hong Kong, but now a global a law firm, investment law firm. They often talk about, though, because it focuses a lot on the Asian countries, China, they often talk a lot about de-dollarization. And today they report that the Duma Deputy Speaker, Alexander Babakov, did say that, and this has been a debate, and I know you've been following it, Ben, about whether there's going to be robust discussion about de-dollarization and a new Brics currency. There's been conflicting reports. However, there's been a lot of excitement about this. So now, Russia has been pretty, I would say, forward about its support for such a development. But I'm wondering your analysis. You've been covering this for a while. You do a lot of geopolitical economy, really relating these geopolitical developments with their economic roots. Talk about this drive to de-dollarization led by Brics as the summit comes up. What are the contradictions? What are some of the issues that Brics may have to contend with? And let's just start there because it's a huge topic.
Yeah, this is massive. And there has been a lot of debate about this, and there have been conflicting reports. So in the nutshell, what we can say is that in the August summit of the Brics, which is coming up the 22nd to the 24th of August, what has been confirmed 100% is that the countries that are participating are all interested in finding alternatives to the US dollar. What those alternatives are up for debate. But the fact that these countries are trying to seek alternatives to the dollar is unquestionable. Pretty much everyone agrees. So there's been a lot of discussion of countries encouraging their national currencies being used in bilateral trade. And this is something that pretty much everyone in Brics agrees with. So China has been using yuan in its trade with countries like Russia. Russia has been using rubles in its trade with countries. And India has also been encouraging this as well. Brazil, of course, has been encouraging this. Brazil and China signed an agreement to do bilateral trade using yuan and the Brazilian real. And what the real debate is about is whether or not there will be a new currency or unit of account that will be used internationally as a replacement for the dollar in international trade, and specifically to be used to be held in the foreign exchange reserves of central banks. That's the debate, and there have been conflicting reports. And I think it's pretty easy to explain why. Some countries in Brics and interested in Brics are not as gung-ho about creating a something like the bond core. What is that? So the world-renowned economist John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, center-left economist who is very influential, he proposed this idea at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, which established the international financial architecture today. This is toward the end of World War II. The Bretton Woods Conference is what established the IMF and the World Bank, controlled by the US. And it's also what established the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Although that moment in 1944, the dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate, an exchange rate of $35 per ounce of gold. So if you had $35 anywhere in the world, you could exchange that for gold at a set rate. That changed in 1971, when US President Richard Nixon ended the convertibility of the dollar into gold, cutting the link to gold and making the dollar freely floating like most currencies today. So anyway, coming back to now. So the discussion is whether or not they will create something like the bond core, which is what John Maynard Keynes proposed as an alternative to using the US dollar as the global reserve currency. The idea was instead to create an international currency, in scare quotes, but it's not really a currency because you and I are not going to use it to buy bread and toilet paper at the store. Instead, it's really a unit of account that different countries around the world can use to balance their trade. Because when you have what economists call balance of payments, when you have international trade, some countries export way more than they import, like China or Germany. Some countries import way more than they export, like the United States. So you have this imbalance in international trade, and you have to figure out a way to keep like the balances, to work them out so that they all come to zero. And most of that is done with dollars, which of course helps the United States and artificially inflates the value of the US dollar. But what has been proposed as an alternative, what Keynes proposed, is Bancor, which is essentially an international currency that is not linked to one currency like the dollar. It's basically consists of a basket of different currencies and potentially commodities. So it's a neutral international currency that countries can use for trade to help balance out their balance of payments, right? So the question is Brics going to adopt something very similar to that? Russia has suggested multiple times that Russia wants to create, and other countries, China is interested in creating an international currency that can be held in foreign exchange reserves of central banks. However, some countries like India have expressed opposition to that. And India's foreign minister, Jaishankar, said that they're not talking about that. Instead, India only wants to promote the use of their national currency, the rupee, in bilateral trade with other countries. And I think it's very easy to explain why. India, it's not fair to say that India is like a Western Trojan horse. I think that's not a fair description. Some people say that. But India does have very close relations with the West and is trying to improve its relations with the US and move closer to the US. India is part of what is effectively an anti-China alliance in the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, with the US, Japan, and Australia, and also India. And India does have very complex relations with China. But at the same time, again, I don't want to overstate. I have no sympathy for the Indian government, which is very right-wing, very Islamophobic, and carrying out a lot of Hindu nationalist policies that they've been repressing the left. All of that said, I'm not sympathetic to BJP and Modi, but India has a long history of non-alignment, of an independent foreign policy. It is a massive country, and it aspires to be a global power. So calling India like a Western Trojan horse is not accurate. India is trying to do what it thinks is in its best interest. It is antagonizing China, but at the same time, India what it really wants is it wants to encourage the use of its currency in bilateral trade with other countries. It's not interested in third world nationalism anymore. It's not interested certainly in the non-aligned movement, strengthening it really. Right after the British independence from Indian independence from British colonialism in 1947, when the Congress Party had kind of more of a left orientation before it became neoliberal, and Nehru was in power, they did have much more support for third world national liberation movements and third world nationalism. Whereas today India has really abandoned that. But anyway, the point is that India is trying to do what's in India's interest. So the long story short is that inside Brics, it seems to be that there's some opposition, or there's not some interest by some countries in, and of course, Brics is going to be expanding soon. It's going to be Brics Plus. Over 40 countries have expressed interest in joining Brics, and it's almost a certainty that numerous countries will be officially admitted into Brics at the summit this August. So in the short term, it seems like what they're going to promote is the use of local currencies, national currencies in bilateral trade, like the kinds of agreements we've seen between Russia and China, China and Brazil. And in the medium term to the long term, we will see a new currency emerge that is an international currency like the Bancor as a challenge to the dollar. Russia has publicly confirmed it numerous times, but there have also been statements from officials saying that it's a complicated process and it's not going to be something that happens immediately in 1 year or even 2 years. We're probably seeing something that's going to maybe take 5 to 10 or potentially longer years to develop this new system. And I expect what we'll see at the summit this August is the announcement of new mechanisms to encourage bilateral trade in different local currencies. And what is certain is the expansion of Brics. And some of the names that we've seen floated is likely going to be potentially Indonesia, potentially Algeria, potentially United Arab Emirates, potentially Saudi Arabia, potentially Egypt. So we'll see how it goes.
Yes. The expansion is definitely on the table, and I'm sure there's going to be talk about currency and trade, and that's 100% going to be spoken about. And I think all those issues you bring up are very valid. One thing I wanted to ask you, there's been also a lot of reports. I've noticed this, and I think there are some who are real like Brics naysayers. I don't know if you've seen them. There's a whole strand, even people like Patrick Bond and some others who call Brics countries sub-imperialist, right? So Russia and China sub-imperialist. They basically the whole Cold War line of, well, neither Washington nor Beijing, neither Washington nor the Soviet Union. Oops, it's actually the Russian Federation. Like that. There is a mentality there, but at the same time, I think there are even people who think less like that, but still see, well, this whole notion of Brics, it's not that significant. They're actually not going to be able to lead any kind of charge because of these divisions. And one thing I wanted to ask, there's been all these reports too. So as this is happening, you have this as these people are talking like that, you have the reality of the mainstream media, a lot of these Financial Times, you have major economists coming out in these investment-linked media panicking, first of all, about this notion of maybe the dollar will be replaced. They panic. They say, oh, this could be bad for us. Then they also start floating out, the Wall Street Journal, for example, floating out these little nuggets of stories. Reuters, too. They'll say, well, Brazil is actually not interested in expansion. And then the next day, Lula will say, actually, no, we're very much for Brics expansion. What do you think of these stories and reports as there is this kind of attitude, I think, especially in the West, that, for those who actually pay attention to something like Brics, they may diminish its significance. And what do you think that's all about?
Well, yeah, a lot of points to respond to there. I'll start with this kind of gray propaganda where it's not really clear where it comes from, where they're trying to, poison the well and say that Brazil is not really interested. It's absurd. I mean, first of all, Lula was one of the co-founders of the Brics. Before it was Brics, it was Bric, B-R-I-C. He was one of the co-founders. In fact, of all of the original co-founders of Brics, he's the only leader who's still in power. I mean, he obviously left and came back. In fact, when BRIC was founded, it actually wasn't Putin who was president. It was Medvedev, and she wasn't president yet. So all these people trying to say Lula is like not down with Brics is absurd. He was one of the co-founders. Anyway, also on record publicly, Lula has repeatedly said that he wants to expand Brics, and he's publicly said that not only does he support Argentina joining, he's been lobbying for Argentina to join, he also supports Venezuela joining. So the idea that like Lula, I mean, that's a whole... Lula is a nationalist, and the Brazilian government is going to do what's in Brazil's interest. He's not going to antagonize the United States because he knows that the U.S. backed a coup against him and against his predecessor, Dilma Rousseff. The U.S. backed the car wash operation backed by the U.S. Department of Justice and FBI that imprisoned him in 2018 on fake charges, handing the victory to Bolsonaro. And then Bolsonaro went and visited CIA headquarters. I mean, Lula's a very smart guy. He knows that, but he also knows that he can't antagonize the imperial hegemon that is trying to control his country. Anyway, the point is that Lula took a one-day trip to the U.S. He took a 4-day trip to China. He didn't sign anything in the U.S. He signed over a dozen comprehensive agreements in China. We all know where Brazil is heading. We can see what direction the political winds are going in. So now, as for the naysayers of Brics, I mean, first of all, if you read their arguments, they always misrepresent what Brics is, and then they attack the misrepresentation. No one has claimed, at least seriously, that Brics is a vanguard for socialism and whatever. No, Brics represents the economic interests of developing formerly colonized countries. And within the Brics, there is a big variety of countries with very different governments. So China obviously has a socialist government. Brazil has a progressive, nationalist, left-wing government. South Africa, it's it goes back and forth between kind of more neoliberal, but also more nationalist, left-leaning under the ANC. It changes, right? Russia has a nationalist government that is absolutely down with the anti-colonial struggle, and India has a right-wing government, a very right-wing government, but it also has nationalist policies. It's very neoliberal economically, but it's genuinely interested in trying to develop India, although it's not been able to develop India because of the neoliberal policies being imposed by the government, which is also, anyway, that's a whole long story. The point is that there's a lot of contradictions within BRICS, and they're going to expand, and there will be more contradictions. You'll have Indonesia, which also has a nationalist, developmentalist government. You'll have Saudi Arabia, which is just a complete monarchy petrostate, right? I mean, the point is that it represents the economic interests of developing countries. Insofar as these countries are trying to develop new economic infrastructure, financial architecture to develop themselves and challenge the imperialist financial architecture that was created through Bretton Woods and through basically colonialism that dominates the world today. I mean, the global South desperately needs alternatives to the Bretton Woods system, to the IMF, to the World Bank, to the United Nations itself, which clearly is not being democratized. The West is dragging its feet, trying to prevent the democratization of the UN. Every single year, large countries like India and Indonesia and Brazil are saying we need to expand the Security Council. Why are France and Britain, countries that are frankly economically not very significant, and in terms of their population, 80 million people compared to 1.4 billion in India, or hundreds of millions in Indonesia and Pakistan and Brazil, and yet they don't have permanent seats on the UN Security Council? The point is that the Global South needs these institutions in order to develop, and then that provides economic space for new models that are alternatives to neoliberalism. And this is exactly the point that Michael Hudson has often stressed, that a lot of these ultra-leftists or trots or social democrat defeatists, that they never can wrap their mind around. Neoliberalism is a particular phase of capitalism, of the capitalist world system, of US unipolar hegemonic domination. It's no coincidence that neoliberalism arose at the moment of peak US unipolar hegemony, with the decline, the internal contradictions in the Soviet Union, and the eventual overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991 in a coup backed by the West. I mean, it was in the 1980s when neoliberalism emerged, because before that, in the so-called golden era of capitalism, with all these Keynesian policies, that was the moment in which capital was being threatened by the rise of communist governments in the Soviet Union and China, and third world national liberation struggles, which were all led basically by socialists. Capital was forced in these Western governments to make concessions to labor, forced to allow labor unions, to allow robust welfare states and social policies. And ever since the rise of neoliberalism, with the decline of challenges to Western imperialism, with the decline, neoliberalism rose and capital became stronger. They went hand in hand. So all of these ultra-leftists and trots and defeatists who said neither Washington nor Moscow, but what that really means is they actually end up allying with Washington always. And they're always wrong, always. They were wrong about Yugoslavia. They were wrong about Syria. They were wrong about Libya. They're wrong today. They're always wrong. And now their whole argument about how the Soviet Union was also imperialist and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it ignores the fact that just the existence of the Soviet Union, the existence of another pole, forced Western governments to make concessions to labor. It forced capital to make concessions to labor. That's why union density was so much higher. Obviously, I'm not discounting the importance of the local struggle, of the class struggle, of workers unionizing, right? But the class struggle never went away, right? It's the fact that Western governments no longer had to make concessions to labor because there was no longer the threat of a systemic alternative with the overthrow of the Soviet Union. And, China was maintaining a policy of lying low and biding its time, right? That's what they said. Maintain a low profile and bide your time to develop your productive forces. Now we're at a moment today where there are alternatives to neoliberalism. There are alternatives to capitalism. And by creating space through institutions like Brics, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it provides economic alternatives to countries in the global south to develop and to implement new alternatives to neoliberalism and even capitalism, which was not possible in the 1990s. Look, I mean, I respect the Cuban Revolution with all of my heart, and what they've been through is incredible. The fact that the Cuban Revolution has survived. But I've talked to a lot of people who lived in Cuba in the 1990s. The special period was very difficult. Brutal. I mean, we shouldn't romanticize the 1990s and 2000s. I mean, it was a brutal period of counter-revolution. That was the period of U.S. unipolar hegemony. That was the period of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism was materially enforced by the U.S. empire. It wasn't just a matter of ideology. South Africa had an anti-colonial struggle. They overthrew the apartheid regime. The ANC came to power and they realized, oh, damn, we have so few economic alternatives that they actually ended up implementing some neoliberal policies. I mean, the global south needs economic alternatives, and just lecturing them for not being pure enough, for not just closing themselves off to the rest of the world and building an autarkist system where they can develop themselves. This is just ridiculous bourgeois idealism. I mean, the DPRK has been suffering under these brutal sanctions. Of any country in the world, it's probably the one that's tried to implement some of these kind of autarkist policies. And even they are like, we really want to improve our relations with China and Russia and other countries. We want to trade more. We want more help to develop local industries, because that's how you actually develop. This idea that like you can just, implement socialism overnight and then nationalize everything, and magically you're going to have a very advanced, developed economy. You're going to magically develop advanced industries in a formerly colonized country that was underdeveloped and doesn't have advanced industry. How do they expect to do it? These people they don't know anything about economics. They don't know anything about developing socialism. They're idealists. I mean, they really think that socialism is just like, tomorrow you have a revolution and everything is perfect and you're living like in like the future. You're living in like a sci-fi movie. These people are profoundly unserious, and they don't understand the basics of imperialism. And again, they're wrong about everything. People like Patrick Bond, they were wrong about Yugoslavia. They were wrong about the Soviet Union. They were wrong about Cuba. They were wrong about Nicaragua. They were wrong about Venezuela. They were wrong about the war in Libya, which they all supported. They were wrong about the war in Syria, which they all supported. And today they're wrong about Russia and China supposedly being imperialist. And they're wrong about Brics being another voice of neoliberalism and blah, blah, blah. For them, nothing is ever pure enough except the revolutions that fail. The revolutions that fail were the ones that would have been the best revolution ever. But because they failed, because they didn't have to muddy their hands with the existing reality, well, that's what makes them perfect, right?
It's so interesting when that kind of idealism almost turns inward. It's almost like the absence of thinking. It's almost like the absence of, it's like that's where it leads to. It leads to this emptiness, this, this a reality. It's a reality that doesn't exist. And, one of the things I wanted to note too is that, you have, the head of interest rate management, Credit Suisse, Zoltan Pozsar, understands this. You can, if you read the Financial Times, all of his articles are basically like warnings to investors, to monopolists. It's like warning, warning, warning. Brics is happening, but it's not just Brics. And this is, I think, really important to note too, is Brics is an incredibly important development. But it fits in this context that you were speaking of, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Of course, you also have China and Russia-led multilateral structures like the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, which are arguably more developed and robust in terms of what they're able to do, given the leadership is, I think, a lot more streamlined. There's a lot fewer contradictions to get through, because most global south countries say, yes, we want investment. Yes, we want trade. And if you're willing to do that with no strings attached, of course, we're going to invest in infrastructure. With Brics, there, of course, are more They're all trying to lead as one, and I think that's a more difficult political project, but it's grown mightily. And then you have some others, these unserious people that you're talking about, Ben, who will literally say things like Brics was founded by Goldman Sachs, just because Jim O'Neill, this British economist who wrote a paper for a Goldman Sachs journal, and I think he was like an asset manager at some point in his life for Goldman Sachs, that somehow that means he founded Brics. It's wild, but I think it speaks to how something like Brics gets diminished in the overall narrative management that you spoke about earlier. Manufacturing consent against something like Brics is you use this misinformation to delegitimize these very real developments, very important developments, and ones that major corporatists, capitalists, monopolists, financiers, they're all very worried about. And I think they should be, because these countries are huge. They're a huge part of the global economy. So if you could speak to that to maybe close up the Brics preview side of this.
Yeah, I mean, you raise an interesting point about the financial press, and this is what I was saying earlier, that the financial press is written for investors. It's written for capitalists. They don't need all of the propaganda, ideological management, manufacturing consent. They need the actual information so they can make money. That's all they care about. And that's why the financial press is often much more honest. They're not the New York Times. They're not trying to convince you about the superiority of the Western liberal imperial project. No, they're telling you this is what you need to know, whether or not you should invest or withdraw your capital. And when it comes to Brics, Brics is an institutional framework for developing countries to develop their economies. And they can do that in a variety of different ways. There's not one development path, right? So, I mean, again, this idea that like Brics, that people like you and I are portraying Brics as like the new international. No one seriously is claiming that. It's absurd. So they're always attacking the straw man, the people who attack Brics. No, Brics is it's a platform that offers opportunity and new infrastructure financially and economically for countries to pursue new economic paths of development. And insofar as it broadens and grows in influence, that's good for countries in the global south that don't want to be under the boot of Western capital, which they've been under for hundreds of years now, right? And this is what we were talking about with Niger. Again, multiple countries in West Africa, their currencies are controlled by France, and they're also the CFA franc is pegged to the euro, which means that their monetary policy is set by the European Central Bank. So all these things that we're talking about with the rising interest rates, what that also means is for a lot of these countries in the global south, and including countries, by the way, that don't have their currencies pegged to the euro, as the U.S., the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Central Bank, semi-private, and the European Central Bank, as they raise interest rates, it is often forcing countries in the global south to raise their interest rates. Otherwise, their currencies will devalue against the U.S. dollar and the euro, and there will be massive capital flight as investors withdraw their capital and put it in the United States and Europe, where they'll have higher interest. And what that also means is that if they don't continue to raise interest rates, which means cause an economic crisis in their own country, right? Because the more you raise interest rates, the higher the possibility of a recession, and it's more difficult to lend money, which means economic activity tends to decrease. But furthermore, if they don't raise their interest rates significantly, their currencies will devalue against the dollar and the euro, and that makes it more difficult for them to pay for imports of things like oil. And it also means that it's harder for them to pay off their debt that is denominated in dollars usually. So we're talking about these economic policies that are implemented by the West, but they have profound impacts on the global south and is trapping them further and further in unpayable debt. So that's why so many countries are desperate for alternatives to this neo-colonial system that was created in Bretton Woods in 1944. And there have been very few alternatives offered. This is one of the few. These people are constantly criticizing Brics. Well, where is their alternative? I mean, these people have no influence. They have no way of providing an alternative. Furthermore, let's talk about the reality. Brics now represents the 5 founding members of Brics represent a larger percentage of the global economy than the G7. The G7 is the cartel of Western imperialist countries plus Japan, right? The US, Japan, Canada, Germany, France, Italy, I'm skipping one there, the UK. Their GDP taken together is around 30%. And this is when you measure GDP. So for people who don't know, gross domestic product, this is all of the goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. It's the size of a country's economy. It's not a great measurement because it doesn't include inequality. Rich people can get richer, poor people can get poorer, but GDP can go up. It doesn't talk about the kinds of economic activity that happen in a country. So the US in the financialized bubble economy, the GDP has been growing, but a lot of that's been in financial industries, in the tech sector. It's not in manufacturing. Manufacturing as a percentage of GDP has been decreasing. It's also in a lot of service jobs. It's in like Uber jobs, like this very precarious work. So it's not take GDP with a grain of salt. It's not the best measurement, but as a very blunt measurement of the size of a country's economy, the G7 countries together, when you measure their GDP at purchasing power parity, which is the best way to measure it, they represent around 30% of the global GDP. The Brics countries represent 1/3, nearly 33%, over 32% of global GDP, and growing. And by the way, over half of that is China. China today represents 31%, nearly 1/3 of global manufacturing. The US represents half of that and constantly declining. So not only in terms of the size of the Brics economies, but also more importantly, in terms of manufacturing, the Brics countries represent more than 1/3 of global manufacturing. In terms of production of raw materials and agriculture, they represent over 40% of world commodities production. So we're talking about massively growing countries that represent a huge part of global commodities production compared to declining, decaying, neoliberal financialized economies in the G7. If you're a country in the global south and you look at these two blocks, where you think you're going to, you can see where history is moving. It's very clear what direction the Brics is headed in. And that explains why so many countries in the global south, including countries that have historically been Western allies, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, that's why they're also interested in joining and getting involved in this. Because as the world becomes more and more multipolar, and as Western imperialism is in crisis and declining, that provides so much more breathing room and space for countries in the global south to pursue new economic paths of development, including socialism, like we see in China, like we see in Vietnam, like we see in Laos, in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia. All of these countries are on board with this. And it's so funny because we're told to listen to Patrick Bond, who's a white guy in South Africa. There can be white people who have good analysis of this, right? Like, I'm a white guy, but come on, a white guy in South Africa who's constantly criticizing every global South liberation struggle, just reinforcing this kind of neo-colonial history. We're supposed to listen to him and not listen to every single left-wing government in the global South, which is all on board with this. Venezuela has applied to join Brics. Bolivia has applied to join Brics publicly. They've confirmed that. Cuba and Nicaragua have both expressed interest in joining Brics. And they have all been very enthusiastic about their support for Brics and their support for China and Russia. So we're supposed to ignore all of them and listen to some people in Europe who have no political influence, but they write some articles criticizing every single global South project for never being pure enough.
Yeah. Well, speaking of decay, and maybe we can, perhaps this will be maybe the last two topics. Let's get to, so this past weekend, there was reports of, and it was coming from the Wall Street Journal, that there were 11 vessels, naval vessels from China and Russia spotted near Alaska. And of course, it was Alaska, these two Republicans, they were making, Dan Sullivan, Lisa Murkowski were making a huge deal of it. They were saying, it was aggressive, it was hostile. But the U.S., the Northern Command, the command structure responsible for this part of the U.S. military, U.S. Navy, said that these forces did not cross into U.S. territory, did not cross into U.S. waters. It remained in international waters. So, I know you talk a lot about this military buildup, but this story has been making the rounds, and I think, it is quite hypocritical. China, of course, has responded. Russia, not so much, has not responded because it's mainly been targeted at China as a China-led operation, showing that China is becoming more aggressive in closer and closer to the U.S.'s territory. I mean, what is your reaction to this? There's so much that we could talk about when it comes to this military buildup, but surprise, surprise, it's being framed as a dangerous provocation on the side of China, and of course, its willing partner, Russia.
I mean, it's just another example of the hypocrisy that we've been talking about for the last hour, Danny. I mean, just the incredible imperial hypocrisy of these countries. The U.S. constantly is threatening China and also Iran with military ships right off of their borders, constantly going through the Taiwan Strait, going through the also Hormuz as well, threatening Iran, constantly. Like on a weekly basis, we see reports. So now one time a Chinese ship goes close to Alaska, although it's, again, exaggerated, and they freak out. So it's like, wait, so when China criticizes the United States and you say that it's just a freedom of, the freedom of the sea navigation exercise, why can't China do it? I mean, it's just like, what else is there to say that these people, it's so hypocritical that the U.S. foreign policy is quite literally, I can do whatever I want. The U.S. can bully the world, send troops everywhere, have 800 foreign military bases, spend more on our military than the next 9 largest military spenders combined. The U.S. spends 40% of the U.S. military budget is 40% of global military expenditure. And then when another country does something that's like a tiny little fraction of what the U.S. does, then they say, oh, they're threatening us. And what I will add, I mean, you already said it yourself, but what I will add, I think an interesting point is, again, how this is completely bipartisan and how the supposedly new GOP that's challenging globalism or whatever. You have these people like Dan Sullivan, who is defending Trump, but now they're all on board with the anti-China hysteria, and they're all being like, China's threatening us by sending the ship. So I mean, it just shows that in Washington there's completely bipartisan support for this new Cold War on China, and at every single stage they're just going to use anything they can to portray China and Russia as threats. I will add another interesting point. This isn't what you were talking about, but just because we're talking about military exercises, another very interesting thing that hasn't got a lot of attention is not only have China and Russia been doing joint military exercises, but China, Russia, and Iran have been doing joint military exercises. Nowhere near the U.S., of course, but I mean, it's also just interesting in terms of seeing this alliance, this Eurasian alliance work, solidify itself. Not only economically, we've spent the past hour talking about the geopolitical and economic elements of this alliance that has been worked out through institutions like Brics, which is largely economic. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is largely security focused and kind of political focused. And we even see now military alliances being worked out where you see China and Russia doing a lot of military exercises, and also even with Iran. So I mean, that is fascinating, because if you go back and you read the books of a lot of these U.S. imperial strategists, like, for instance, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is U.S. national security advisor under U.S. President Carter, and he wrote a book in the 1990s, The Grand Chessboard, in which he discussed ways that the U.S. could maintain unipolar control over the planet. And he said one of the biggest threats to U.S. imperial hegemony would be a counter-hegemonic alliance between China, Russia, and Iran, which is what we've seen emerge in no small part thanks to U.S. neocolonial policies constantly antagonizing these countries, waging hybrid war against all three of them, and encouraging them to move closer and closer together as allies.
Indeed, indeed. And I do want to let me pull up the map because I think it's important that people look at what is being spoken about. So USA Today actually did publish the map of this region that they were speaking of. And here is, let me zoom in on the map so people can see it a little clearer. So here is the international line, the international date line. Here are these islands that they're talking about. And this is where it was reported that these vessels were sailing close to. And look, there's Russia. All right. Basically, what this amounts to is telling Russia, telling China that they can't sail their ships outside of their ports. And it totally, of course, it's easy when a lot of maps, for example, totally over exaggerate the size of North America and the United States compared to Asia. But I think the larger point here is that the United States and Biden has continued this, if not escalated further, always uses this freedom of navigation operations exercise. Like they need to do this. This has increased, 5-10-fold over the last 3 or 4 years alone. Warships, destroyers sent through the South China Sea, sent into the Taiwan Straits, as you mentioned, Ben. I mean, that is not international waters if the one China policy is being followed. Like that is also sailing into China's territorial waters. So all this is to say is it's both a double standard and quite ironic that now these standard exercises, and this is the third time this has been done. It wasn't made a big deal of, though, just a year ago, 2 years ago. This is the third time. And now there's the hype about it. And I'm wondering what you think that's about. I mean, do you feel like it's about that these countries are now actually working more closely together, and that's frightening the United States? Or is it just another excuse to justify further buildup? Because we know that that's always on the agenda, to build up further, to send more warships, to increase the military budget. Another 2, 3, 4 times over the next decade. I mean, what do you think?
Well, it's both of those and more. I mean, the U.S. is looking for anything it can get to demonize China. And we saw the incredible hysteria over balloons, over Chinese balloons this February that were probably weather balloons or a Chinese balloon. And there were U.S. officials who later admitted that it was likely a weather balloon that was pushed off course. China did not mean for the weather balloon to go into U.S. airspace. And people portrayed that as like an act of war, basically. And now we see this. I mean, anytime the U.S. can get some kind of ammunition to demonize China, we're going to see it. Because we're in a new Cold War. And even more than the first Cold War, in Cold War II, the second Cold War, propaganda is so important. If you think about Cold War I, compared to Cold War II, in Cold War I against the Soviet Union and other socialist countries, people maybe had radio at first, and then they had TVs, but they certainly weren't spending a lot of time watching the news, and they certainly didn't have anything like social media. We now spend all day with our phones in our pockets, on social media, seeing news, seeing people talk about these political issues. We're so immersed in all of this discussion of politics all day long. And that's why it's so important for them to have these propaganda narratives to basically brainwash people to want war with China. And we've seen these studies recently, these polls that show how in the United States, just a few years ago, like 10 years ago, a plurality of people in the US did not see China as a threat. And now a plurality or even a majority, depending on the poll you look at, see China as a threat. And that just shows the effectiveness of the manufacturing of consent, the effectiveness of this media propaganda. And as part of that machine, they have to constantly demonize China and Russia, no matter what they do, to continue to justify these aggressive policies, to justify massive military expenditure, constantly increasing. Very soon, it's going to reach $1 trillion, probably by 2030. On paper, $1 trillion. It's already well over $1 trillion when you consider all the other spending. So, I mean, again, And this new Cold War is a gift that keeps on giving for Western monopoly capital. We've seen constant reports where there was just a report in the British newspaper, The Telegraph, about Chinese electric vehicles, because now China, thanks to state policy, thanks to state planning, industrial policy, China has become the world's largest car manufacturer in just 3 years. And a big reason for that is because it's leading the world in electric vehicle manufacturing. And now the British media is scaring the British public about these Chinese EVs, saying that they could be used to spy on people. So now Western corporations are going to use the so-called threat of Chinese electric vehicles to lobby the governments to impose tariffs and other measures and ban these Chinese competitors, which is exactly what they did with Huawei, right? They ban and put tariffs on their competitors to maintain the monopolies of these Western corporations. So everyone, I mean, the capitalist class benefits, the political class benefits, and the military industrial complex, of course, always at the end of the day is the biggest beneficiary of all.
Yeah. And I mean, as you said, it's like hypocrisy. It's all of these interests and more. I mean, the more we're going to continue, I think, to hear about. I think it's almost an every other day, if not a daily, report about Chinese aggression, China's aggression in this part of the world, in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Straits. Right? It's always Chinese aggression, and I think that, you know, we're going to not just hear more and more about it, but it's going to continue to justify, as you said, further buildup, even in just response. The United States, of course, not surprising, sent, I think, 6 warships, a couple destroyers to, to that international line as a show of force. And Jake Sullivan, he said, "Oh, this just shows how Russia and China are increasingly more dangerous and more aggressive." And yes, this is fueling an entire policy agenda. There is a whole policy agenda here. This is not just one area. It's not just military provocations. It fits into this whole agenda with China, which is to undermine it. And we've said it. I know you've talked about this, about the relationship to the Ukraine proxy war, to China, to basically everything that the U.S. is doing right now has to do with China. And now we're seeing, I think, China, Russia, they are standing up more. They're standing taller in the military realm alone to the United States and to the West. There's no more of this, let's play nice. There's more preparations. Of course, we've seen China do pretty intense exercise to the Taiwan Straits after numerous visits. And we're also seeing the this overall posture by China. I mean, when I was there, people were talking about, they asked me, what do you think about, why do they want to go to war with us? Why does your government want to go to war with us? And then I would ask them, oh, well, what's the attitude here? Like, what's the People's Liberation Army? Like, how do people talk about that? And they're like, oh, well, people are like ready to join. They want to defend China. Like, this is not a joke. People take it very seriously. In the People's Liberation Army, you see it all over the country. There's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of spirit for defending China, because this threat of war is very real. And we get to hear about how China's the sole provocateur, but that's not the reality.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. This is how it always works. I mean, not to sound like pessimistic, but this isn't new. Like, this is exactly the strategy the U.S. has used again and again and again and again, and will continue using. But I think the difference now is that, objectively speaking, the material conditions have changed, and the U.S. is much weaker, especially economically. Now, yes, militarily, the U.S. can blow up the world many times over. It spends all its money on its military, more than the next 9 biggest military spenders combined, 40% of global military spending. But by the way, just because you spend a lot of money doesn't mean it's actually being spent effectively. A lot of this is just going into the coffers of the military industrial complex. It's basically just corruption. I mean, a lot of this, You see how many billions of dollars they spent on the F-35 and all of this with very few successes. And so, I mean, yes, militarily, the U.S., you could say, has an advantage, but economically, absolutely not. The U.S. economy is in, I mean, there are all these reports saying that the U.S. economy is better than people think. But no, I mean, since the 2008 financial crash, which was caused by the neoliberal financialization of the economy and these big bubbles, ever since it was a jobless recovery, we saw the increasing use of precarious labor, more and more people in the US working multiple part-time jobs with no benefits, the Uberization of the US working class, people working for these apps where they have no job security. We see increasing housing costs, skyrocketing healthcare costs, skyrocketing education costs, nearly $2 trillion in student loans, these massive bubbles that are bursting. And meanwhile, we're not seeing a return to good manufacturing jobs. Instead, I mean, people say, oh, well, you know, the economy is growing, but where is that growth happening? It's not happening in the productive economy. So the U.S. is economically in an increasingly worse and worse situation. And China is the world's global, you know, it's the world's factory. It's a global manufacturing superpower. The living standards of the Chinese working class have massively increased since 1949 and the revolution. More than 800 million people lifted out of poverty. I mean, I've said this a few times here, but I just need to repeat it. If you talk to a lot of people in the global south, they can see very clearly, even people who are not, you know, anti-imperialist or on the left or nationalists or whatever, most people can see where the economic and political winds are blowing. And they're blowing in the direction of the rise of China, the rise of the global south, and these countries that were colonized by the Western powers for hundreds of years. And many of them got their formal independence on paper in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the national liberation struggles, but they never really got their economic independence. And, you know, Kwame Nkrumah, the founding father of Ghana, a revolutionary, a socialist, he wrote a book about neocolonialism and how until these countries have economic independence, they won't have real independence. But what we're seeing now is the creation of the conditions in which countries, if they pursue an economic development path in support of their working class, they can finally have independence. Now, we're going to see a lot of countries in the global south that don't choose that path. They continue to go down the capitalist path and have an elite that continues to gobble up their wealth while working people don't have their living standards risen. But we're going to see a lot of other countries that say, well, it worked for China, it's working for Vietnam, it's working for other countries, and we're going to take it upon ourselves. And a lot of countries, even countries you wouldn't expect, are looking to China, especially for its economic leadership. They're not going to emulate everything about China, but they're saying like, wow, China has figured it out, and we're going to try to do that ourselves.
Yeah, no, that's all of those are very good points, and I think it is, all of this is part of what I think is a tectonic shift. I mean, what is obviously a tectonic shift in the overall global situation. The United States needs to rely on, and of course, it's so-called partners in the West. They all need to rely on their so-called military superiority, which, as we've seen in Ukraine, is not actually so superior. It is very much limited by what I wonder if you could comment on, Ben. There is this threat of nuclear war, and I think that China and Russia, China especially, it has this huge advantage as it becomes a bigger and bigger economy, as it doesn't need to rely on, it can be a part of the world economy. It is obviously it's the most important economy arguably in the world, but at the same time, its governance system, its socialist political economy gives it obvious advantages. So in terms of how it can develop itself and still play a role in the world economy without sacrificing its national interests. Yet China doesn't have to. While we see all these reports about Chinese aggression, China actually doesn't have to rely on what the United States and the West has to rely on, this outward military force. It doesn't have to go places and plunder and do all of that, despite being accused of it. It has the resources. And actually, the reason why it's becoming more and more important in the world is in part just pragmatic economic reasons. There's too much production going on. There has to be more relationships built with the global South. And if they're coming with no strings attached, it makes absolutely no sense for African countries, countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, anywhere in the world, Asia, to reject that. And we've seen the benefit through the Belt and Road Initiative. You've seen it, I'm sure, in Nicaragua. There is obvious tangible benefits to Chinese investment that you don't see in investment with the West, in investment with the United States. There's a reason why that investment is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, because there's only so much plundering you can do. But in the global South, there's these huge opportunities to grow. These are the richest places in the world in many cases. And so China has these obvious advantages, yet this military buildup and these provocations from the U.S. side does risk nuclear war. And we just went through the anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm wondering if you could talk about this threat of looming nuclear war, given that, the United States may have a huge military, but all of its provocations, it doesn't really point to a shooting war. It points to the potential for nuclear war, since both of these countries, all of the big powers in the world now, are nuclear armed.
It's extremely dangerous. I mean, it couldn't be any more dangerous. We're talking about the possibility of the destruction of the planet. And I mean, in the case of the constant war hysteria against China, I mean, there is more discussion of the insane new Cold War policies against Russia, because it's so obvious in Ukraine, where there is a proxy war happening. People are dying. The U.S. is sacrificing Ukrainians to try to weaken Russia. And in the case of China, it's not as explicit, but there could be a very real possibility of it becoming something very explicit. Clearly in Taiwan, the U.S. has been sending more and more weapons to Taiwan. And the latest development is that the Biden administration is actually putting weapons for Taiwan in the next weapons package for Ukraine to be approved by Congress, which symbolically says so much. I mean, the U.S. NATO pushed Ukraine into this war with Russia, going back to the 2014 coup backed by the U.S. that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected, geopolitically neutral government and installed a pro-Western regime that vowed to join NATO, kickstarting off the civil war. So the U.S. has been constantly pushing Ukraine into the line of fire in this war with Russia. The U.S. is now doing the same with Taiwan, despite the fact that a recent poll found that a majority of people in Taiwan recognize that when Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, went to Taiwan and expressed support for separatism, it actually hurt Taiwan's security. A majority of people in Taiwan agree with that it hurt their security. And the U.S. continues to hurt Taiwan's security by sending more and more weapons, repeating exactly what it did with Ukraine, except it's even crazier because Taiwan is part of China. And the U.S. on paper recognizes that, which is written in international law. And yet the U.S. is preparing to try to do to Taiwan what it's doing to Ukraine. So, I mean, this situation is so crazy. It is so dangerous. And it's completely bipartisan. I mean, it's very easy to point out all of the insane neocons in the Biden administration. You know, we talk about Victoria Nuland, who, let's not forget, she's now the second in command of the U.S. State Department. This July, she was promoted to Deputy Secretary of State, meaning that the only person above her in crafting U.S. foreign policy is Antony Blinken, who's also a neoconservative. I mean, these people are mouth-foaming hawks. They have supported every single war, from the war in Iraq, the war in Libya, the war in Syria. And now Victoria Nuland and all these people, it's very easy to point out how they're pushing for this very aggressive policy against Taiwan as well, or using Taiwan against China. But all the Republicans are on board with this. Even like the so-called, The MAGA Republicans who claim to oppose the war in Ukraine, the proxy war, which is obviously complete BS because a lot of them supported the proxy war. Donald Trump himself boasted of sending weapons, lethal weapons to Ukraine that even Obama refused to send. And Trump boasted, he said, Obama just sent Ukraine towels and sheets. I sent them lethal weapons. And of course, Trump tore up the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty with Russia. He also tore up the Open Skies Treaty with Russia, which is one of the reasons it set off this conflict. So obviously both parties are guilty of this. And now we see that Republicans are even more hawkish when it comes to China, pushing for sending weapons to Taiwan. So, I mean, it's such a disastrous, such a dangerous scenario in the United States. Both parties are completely on board with the war drive with China after seeing exactly what has been happening in Ukraine, which has been a horror show for Ukrainians. These people claim to support the Ukrainian people, and yet tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have died. The New York Times just published an article about how Ukrainian men in their 40s are being drafted to go fight. And they reported that some of the Ukrainian units have had a 200% casualty rate, which means that everyone in the unit died. And then they brought everyone, they filled it up with the new people, and then everyone died again. Like, these are the people who are having their lives sacrificed on behalf of NATO. And the West claims to support them. And now we see the US doing the exact same thing to Taiwan, telling the Taiwanese people, we support you. We support Taiwanese separatism, which is not supported by the majority of people in Taiwan. And a majority of people in Taiwan recognize that the US is making them less secure. What else is there to say? The West, the imperialist powers don't care about what the working people in these countries actually want. We see it in Taiwan. We see it in Niger, where 78% of people in Niger, according to The Economist magazine, support the anti-colonialist policies of the military government. And yet the West is trying to impose the unpopular Western puppet, Bazoum, who has the support of just 1/4 of the population. So it's another repeat. We started our conversation today talking about Niger, but it's the same story. They talk about democracy, but the West, the imperialist powers in the West, they are the undemocratic forces because the only interests they represent are the interests of capital, the interests of monopoly capital, large multinational corporations, not the interest of working people anywhere. Not in Taiwan, not in Niger, and certainly not in the US, certainly not in Britain, certainly not in France.
No, conditions for everyone, everywhere, except for the countries that are sovereign and that have the ability to determine their own economic destinies. Most parts of the world that are caught up in the neoliberal hell that the US and EU, NATO countries are leading, their lives are getting a lot worse, and this militarism certainly doesn't help. But Ben, I've kept you for a while. How are we doing on time? I know that you had something going on a little bit, so perhaps maybe we can close out the interview portion of the show today. All right, so Ben, where can people find you? Whatever you want to plug, please do.
Yeah, well, the best way is I have the link for people watching in the little lower third, geopoliticaleconomy.com. Everything's there. It's the easiest thing, geopoliticaleconomy.com. And if your people are watching on YouTube, definitely subscribe to Danny's channel first. And after you subscribe to his channel, after this ends, don't just leave. Go over to, or better yet, open up a new tab.
Open new tabs. Yeah, you can keep everything running. Savvy tech skills here. Actually, I'll tell people a story. Ben Norton right here is the reason why I have this set up. He suggested the pod mic. He suggested the camera. So he's a very talented videographer and movie maker too. But anyway, continue, Ben.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that we kind of I would never call us YouTubers, but we created shows on YouTube around similar times. Actually, you were even before me, and like I'm really glad it's worked out, and because we need more people who provide good analysis that's critical of imperialism and capitalism and cuts through all of the corporate media propaganda. I'm really happy to see all the awesome work that you do. And I consider, Danny a good friend and comrade in the mutual struggle here. So everyone should subscribe to his channel. You can also find my channel at Geopolitical Economy Report. And yeah, we cover a lot of the same things. And I always really appreciate your analysis, Danny, and keep it up. I'm always very happy to see your channel grow. And I hope you get much more. I hope there are more people who can offer this kind of perspective, because as you know, a lot of channels reporting on geopolitics and international affairs and, especially things involving like China and Russia and the global South are just pure propaganda. I mean, the majority of it is just insane propaganda. It's basically just written by NATO. And in terms of economics, it's even worse. The vast majority of economics reporting is completely neoliberal. So it's always great to have a fellow traveler here who's doing work kind of in the same vein. Thanks for having me, Danny.
Yeah, of course. And most of the good stuff is the number of so-called Americans, people who are very, very tiny, a very, very small number of people who particularly focus on these things. So much appreciated, Ben. Of course, your website is in the video description describing the stream. You can find that in the first sentence, I believe. So people go there. One last thing, though, Ben, before you go. The Talking Wombat on Patreon asked, why did you choose Nicaragua? I don't know, to live, if you wanted to just close out on that.
Oh, man, this could be a long conversation.
In 60 seconds.
Because we're going late. But, first of all, it's an incredible country with an incredible history. I came down here after the U.S.-backed coup attempt in 2018 to do reporting on the coup attempt, which was so distorted in corporate media, it's just pure lies. I mean, I've talked to so many people, victims of the coup attempt, of these U.S.-backed far-right extremists who tried to overthrow the democratically elected Sandinista government. And I've interviewed people whose friends or even family members were killed, were tortured. I've interviewed a guy who lost one of his arms because he was tortured by the US-backed far-right forces that are basically just like the Contras 2.0, right? So anyway, I came here to do reporting, and like a lot of people, by the way, in the 1980s, the solidarity activists from the US and other countries who came in solidarity with the Sandinista revolution, they came and they had discovered it's an incredible, beautiful country with just the climate is great. I was also just really tired of the cold in like New York and other places. It's extremely safe, very safe. It's even safer than the US, which actually isn't saying a lot. It's actually a very violent country. But also, the revolutionary politics still are happening. And it's really exciting to be in a place. It's also great for your mental health, especially if you're like a leftist and anti-imperialist in the US. It can be very hard because you're just always surrounded by so much propaganda and just stupidity and all of that. So it's great to be like surrounded with this revolutionary spirit and people who are just like, they're part of a revolutionary project. And also, as a journalist, an independent journalist, this is my job. This is what I do. It's very affordable. The US and big cities is completely unaffordable. Rent is rising constantly, health insurance, all of that. It's just completely, the living standards are just horrible because you just can't afford anything. So, it was kind of just a no-brainer. And really, it's been such a great experience. It's also really helped me learn a lot more about Latin America, about the global South, about these struggles. It's made me be much more realistic with understanding how, in some cases, having the revolution is actually kind of the easier part. The hard part is actually trying to develop a new path in a world dominated by Western capital, by these imperialist institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, like we've been talking about. If you're a very poor country, so formerly colonized country, there are a lot of reasons, but I really invite people to come visit Nicaragua. It's a beautiful place, especially if you come down for the anniversary of the revolution in July. It really inspires you because you see so many people out in the streets celebrating the revolution with like their flags and everything. It really is. It's just like a great experience. And it also makes sense when you visit. You understand why so many people visited and they decided to stay.
Indeed. Well, thank you again, Ben. We'll have to be in touch very soon as things heat up worldwide. And I wish you a good evening out in Nicaragua. Take care.
Thanks, Danny. Keep up the awesome work. And everyone should
Thanks.
subscribe to his show.
Thanks. Same. Right back at you. Everyone go to the video description after. All right. Bye now, Ben. Let's see. Okay. All right. So we've got we're almost at 2 hours now. So I don't think I'm actually gonna do another story as I had thought I was, which is fine because I think Ben covered a lot of ground. Before I go though, be sure. So last night there was a little bit of a scheduling change. Sorry about that. I was supposed to go live. Did not, but 2 in 2 days is brutal for me, so I don't generally do it. But please do, before you go, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, notifications bell. And also, I'm still raising money to make some updates. Ben actually, as I said, he suggested a lot of this technology. And now that I am doing this more, I am looking to perhaps expand the operation into vlogging as I travel more. I'm going to Vietnam in October. All of these things are very costly, so I'm going to be reporting from Vietnam. I'm going to do videos there as I'm going on a delegation with Veterans for Peace. I'm going to be traveling around major cities, Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Da Nang, and many others. And I'm going to do a lot of reporting from there, talking about Vietnam's process, talking about foreign policy, Vietnam, the legacy of the war, all of that, making hopefully good connections. And you'll want to definitely keep a lookout for that. But I needed to make some updates. And also things like this are quite costly. As Ben said, cost of living is very high out here in the US of A. So please do support the show at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. That's the best place. There's annual memberships. As you saw, I integrated Patreon member questions into the stream. Welcome all Patreon members. There's Substack as well. Subscribe for free, but the paid membership annually as well as monthly gives you similar benefits. You can also do PayPal, Cashapp. Those are all in the video description as well. And my link tree has all of these places too. And be sure to hit that Telegram subscription too. It's free, but it is where I do most of my social media. So you can find that link in my link tree. But nonetheless, please do support Patreon, Substack are the best places. And you can find those links in the video description. Also, welcome all YouTube members. That's a great option too. YouTube actually doesn't provide a lot of great options beyond emojis, and I'm not a big emojis person. Maybe one day I will become one. But if you want to become a YouTube member, I shout you out, in the chat, and I make sure that you have early notifications and other things. So that's a great way, $4.99 per month as well. Although Patreon and Substack tend to be better because they offer annual memberships. With that said, that's the plan. It's one announcement in October. Another announcement Sunday, October 13th. I am going live with Margaret Kimberly and Gerald Horn, Dr. Gerald Horn. You want to save that date. I believe it's going to be 8:30 p.m. Eastern, Sunday, August 13th. So save the date. That's going to be a great conversation. We will be talking about, of course, a lot of the things we usually talk about here, geopolitically with Russia, China. We're going to be talking about Ukraine, I'm sure. We're also going to be talking about, I'm sure we're going to get into this RFK Palestine business. I'm sure we're going to get into a whole lot with Africa, especially Gerald Horn does some great work on the history of Africa, the history of relationships between, let's say, Africans in America, Black people in the US, and of course, the struggle for African independence and African liberation. So he does some great work on that, and you will want to catch that August 13th, Sunday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. Margaret Kimberly will join me. It's been a while since I've been with her, so that will also be fun. With that said, I'm going to do some shout outs of the super chats that I don't know. I might go live Friday as well. Let's see. That is a possibility. Also, there are now, it's not confirmed yet, but I'm working out possibly a testimony at the UN Security Council. You might have caught Max Blumenthal did one. I may be doing one on the dangers that U.S. arms sales, Western arms sales to Ukraine, arms shipments pose to peace. And so that might be happening. People are asking really funny questions in the chat, but that's one thing to keep a lookout. I'll definitely announce that as well, should it be happening, and be sure hopefully to get a video of that. And I can't say I'm not nervous about doing something like that, but I am working that out as well. So that will be really incredible. I mean, it would be an incredible honor to do something like that. It's such an important forum. So yeah, those are the announcements. I don't think I got it in me to do another story tonight, guys. Sorry, but Ben and I covered a lot of ground, and it was really fun today. Really, really, really fun. So let me do shout outs of the super chats. All right, and if I see any YouTube members as well, or if there are any YouTube members in the chat, please do make yourself known, because I don't think I saw anyone here. Maybe I am wrong, or maybe the moderators. Thank you. I see a lot of the moderators here as well. Okay, so let's do this. I know some of you moderators are also members, so thank you. All right. So we have a lot of super chats. Thank you so much for the generosity. We have David. Thank you so much. It was great to have Ben back on. It's been too long. We'll definitely have to do more of this. David again. Thank you so much. You're very generous today. Yeah, no, I would have loved to see that. That would have been a great thing to see Victoria Nuland finally arrested. Stephen Huang, thank you so much for that super sticker. And you are a member too. So shout out to you as a YouTube member. Thanks so much. Pixel Fun Gaming sent us super sticker. Thank you so much, David. Again, of course, I'm appreciative of you and your consistent viewership. We have Salt Thrower. Thank you so much for that. Generous in I think that's Japanese yen terms. Thank you so much, David. Again, thank you so much, David. Again, saying your name a lot today, David. Thanks so much, Yanni Zhang, Australia $4. Thank you so much for that. David, another super. So we have a lot of super stickers here. David again. You are so generous tonight, David. You are certainly very much appreciated. We have Chima Madu. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. The Nigerian Senate has rejected Tinubu's plan for intervention in Niger. However, Nigerian politicians are not really trustworthy, willing puppets. Indeed, this is what I have heard from various sources, and I've also, even growing up, I knew a few Nigerian folks out where I grew up, and I didn't have to. Now that I reflect back on my conversations, I didn't have to ask to then understand years later that the reality of neocolonialism there is very real. So Sam K said, Ben Norton and Danny, awesome show. This needs to happen more frequently. Indeed, it does, and let's see if we can make that happen. I know we both tend to be very busy guys, and I lose track a lot. Notary says, was cool to see collab with Ben. Yes, it was very cool. It was very fun. And something I need. I think for me now, I spend so much time in the stories, the developments, but it's definitely good to start talking about economics, the economic reality. MJR, I see you. Rock and Show, love to see you talk. Thank you so much for the membership, MJR. So, sorry, sadly true. I appreciate your comment, but I didn't mean to put you up. Anyway, great show tonight. Very good. I'm glad you all were able to make it. It was well attended. I appreciate all of you. Make sure that you're subscribing, hitting that notifications bell, subscribe button, all of that. And of course, paid memberships are always appreciated as I begin a journey. I keep saying I'm going to roll out some more features for Patreon members, Substack members, some not really exclusive content per se, but some more interactive stuff. maybe some Patreon only streams that won't be publicly posted afterward, to focus more on some other things. Not really like, I'm not going to change my whole thing, but I think that the things that what I talk about tends to connect to a whole lot of other issues, and plus just ways to get to know you all better. To I just I see people starting all these like self-help channels, and that's certainly not what I'm going to really get into, but just some more kind of like sneak peek stuff, some more fun chats, uh casual. I do like talking more casually. Actually, you probably notice that my style is less uh, sort of hyper prepared. I do prepare stories, but I do kind of like to talk just analytically, what I'm thinking, how I'm thinking. That's more of my style. So I may try to implement more just to keep things fun and fresh, and also to give those who are paid subscribers even a few more features, because I'm trying to build that out as well. Okay. All right, everybody. What people really love my dog, so I'm glad I shared my dog with you on this channel. Um, and Yeah, so I see a lot of people talking about Gonzalo, very unfortunate situation. I have decided that, I think I'm going to now. I haven't really intervened in that situation. You probably know my position on the overall. Like, I want what's best for him. I do have, of course, I'm from the US. I have all my suspicions about a lot of things, a lot of developments, things that are even less, how should I say, close to, I'm a student of the Cold War, and a student of COINTELPRO, and a student of CIA operations and intelligence operations. So yeah, I'm always suspicious, but I do think that, I do think what's most important is to not fight with each other. Like, we've got to keep, especially if we're on the same side. Um, I'm hoping that something like Gonzalo Lira won't divide, as we have our suspicions, but we don't know. I don't know enough. I know my suspicions, and those could be very much heralded. And I think I've been listening to all sides of this, and my thing is, let's let us make our points. Everyone should be free to make their points, but also let's make sure that we're together in the work that is also important, that is actually instrumental to, uh, whether we're on the side of Gonzalo Lira deserves freedom from whatever he's going through, or Gonzalo Lira may be more nefarious of an actor. Regardless of which side we're on, if we're talking about Ukraine, the proxy war, all of this, we have to make sure that we're still together on this, and we can still talk to each other. We can still unite on that, and also the larger geopolitical situation, because that actually connects to the whole. Like, we can't really talk about this case without talking about how we got here, and how we got here was a NATO proxy war that's literally threatening the existence of humanity itself the longer that it goes on. So there's a lot uh to get to, um but I really appreciate all of you all, and I see a lot of good suggestions. I do have a look, here's a couple of things. I take guest suggestions most seriously. Most seriously on Patreon. So that's the biggest feature. Of course, you can do it on Substack too, because the comment section is open to paid subscribers on Substack. Patreon, of course, if you subscribe as a paid member, you'll be able to suggest anything you want to me. I mean, that's one of the big features and I do take suggestions, and I do try to accommodate as best as I can. Now, especially around guests. Now, there was something I wanted to say before I left here. It completely escaped me right out of my head. What was this last thing, everybody? What was this last thing? Oh, for free. So if you want to make suggestions to me for free, I suggest that if you can't subscribe as a paid member anywhere, I'm not a paywaller, so all of these all this encouragement to support me, which I hope is not too nauseating. There's free ways to get in contact with me. The best way now is on Telegram, because unlike Twitter, where you do have to hide your DMs, you can't just be open to everyone on Twitter once you get to a certain follower count, especially with NAFO and all of these things happening, these troll farms. It gets to be incredibly nauseating and despicable. And, I just don't need that in my life. But Telegram now, I do have a chat feature on Telegram. And so if you go to my link tree and you subscribe to my Telegram, that's free. And all the suggestions you have here in the chat that may be going a little too fast for me to follow. And YouTube chat is just disastrous. That's why a lot of people do super chats only. Of course, money is great, but it's also a way to highlight chats. So follow me on Telegram. It's China and Geopolitics. But you can find that link in the link tree in my video description. You can also find it in my channel banner as well. So do that and make these suggestions. I see a lot of good ones, like getting Cornel West on. That will almost for certain happen at some point in the future. He's a friend of this show. He's been on this show before. And as the campaign heats up, I'm really avoiding 2024 election time because for now, I just, and of course, there'll be a lot of geopolitical stuff to talk about with it. I just cannot stand talking about the two-party system for a year and a half before a president, before even the real campaigning starts. Or let me scratch that, because I'm not a campaign expert. I know these oligarchs, they spend $1 billion plus funding one or another presidential candidate. And of course, the campaigning starts basically a year and a half before the first votes are cast. But even so, I don't want to talk about it that much. Like, I feel like, wow, we are so far away from that. Like, we are still in 2023 summer. And the election, of course, is going to be November 2024. And of course, there's a primary. So yes, people will be following the Democratic primary, if there is a primary. The Republican primary, of course. So yeah, I'm sure I'll be talking about it from a perspective of what's going on in the world and whatnot. But no, I can't be talking about it. So I haven't focused on it just yet. But I see a lot of good suggestions. So keep making them. But if you want to get to me, the best place is for free is Telegram. But if you want even more responses, because let's be honest, even Telegram chats can get wild. And I can't always follow everything that's going on in Telegram. But Patreon, I get constant notifications, and it's a little less frequent, so it's a little easier to respond. So that's basically the perks. That's the big perk, honestly. You can, and to be frank, I see it as an integral part of like building a real community is in actually involving the people that support me, because if it, you all come here not just to learn, but you have a lot to contribute. Your understanding and your studying and all of this. The reason why you're here is maybe you found me randomly, or maybe it's because of like minds and because of a common goal, common mission. So, we're all in this together, and I try to integrate, and it's not just about the money. I've certainly tried to be of aid, without compensation, of course. But now that this is my job, as Ben Norton even said, it's his job. Like, we all got to find a way to make it, and to make it work. All right, everybody, that is it. That is, this is funny. Somebody said leftist dog trainers. or even like geopolitical dog training. Like I have been flirting with the idea of not creating a whole new channel for the public, but rolling it out where my dog is getting so good with his training. Like even just sitting with him 20, 30 minutes after a walk outside, practicing him being chill, including him in the streams. Like I think that would be really cool for like a Patreon only thing, Substack only thing. I think that would be really cool. Anyway, it's 11 o'clock at night over here. That's actually a bit relatively early ending for me. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. I'll be back for sure Sunday. And if not Sunday, Friday. All right. So it's not just Sunday. Could be Friday too. Keep a lookout for those notifications. And Sunday, save the date. We've got Margaret Kimberly and Gerald Horn on deck. So you don't want to miss it. All right. All right, everyone. Salute. Thanks so much for tuning in again. And I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.